Kneel, the voice thundered across the arena, and perhaps history will forget you were ever dangerous. Ethan Cole tasted metal before he tasted fear. The air inside the Sereth Victory Basin was dry enough to crack lips and old enough to remember every war the Empire had ever won. Dust drifted through shafts of white gold light pouring from the open crown of the Colosseum, turning the entire place into something halfway between a temple and a courtroom. Somewhere above him, 1,000 ceremonial chimes hummed in the hot wind. Somewhere behind him, a set of magnetic restraints clicked tighter around his wrists. And all around him, more than 40,000 alien voices had gone completely still. Ethan stood in the center of polished black stone, breathing slow through bruised ribs and a throat that felt lined with sand. His boots had left a faint trail behind him, gray dust, dried coolant, and the fine pale grit of the battlefield where his unit had disappeared 3 nights ago. The Sereth had scrubbed him clean enough for public display, but not enough to erase the war. A dark tear still ran down the sleeve of his field jacket where somebody else's blood had dried into the fabric. He noticed that before he noticed the throne. It rose at the far end of the arena on a staircase of white marble, too large for one person and too beautiful for any place built to break another living thing. Behind it, banners of deep cobalt and silver snapped in the wind, each one carrying the sigil of the Sereth Dominion, a spiral blade wrapped around a star. Ethan had seen that symbol burning on dropships, painted on armored carriers, stamped onto supply crates and surrender terms. Up close, it looked less like victory and more like a warning. Human, the voice called again, sharper this time, female and cold enough to cut through the heat, you stand before the dominion of Sereth. By decree of conquest, you will kneel. That was when Ethan finally lifted his eyes and saw her. Commander Vera Thal stood halfway down the marble steps, motionless except for the thin streamers of silver cloth trailing from her shoulders. Even from where he stood, she looked impossible to mistake for anyone else. Her skin carried the faint luminous tone of blue glass under moonlight, turquoise, almost unreal against the pale stone, and the armor fitted. To her frame looked less forged than grown, all elegant lines and seamless plates that caught the sun in icy flashes. Her face was calm in the way winter lakes were calm. Beautiful, if beauty had ever learned discipline instead of softness. She wasn't smiling. That made her more dangerous somehow. Ethan had seen commanders before. He knew the type, officers who barked loud enough to convince everyone around them they were never afraid. Vera wasn't like that. She didn't need volume. The entire arena bent around her silence. One of the guards behind Ethan shoved the back of his shoulder, not hard, just enough to suggest what came next. The crowd leaned forward as one body. This was what they had come for. Not execution. Not justice. Submission. They wanted a symbol. A defeated human on one knee beneath their sky. Ethan swallowed once, slow. His jaw ached from where he'd been struck earlier, and one side of his vision still pulsed faintly from lack of sleep and too much sun. But pain wasn't the problem. Pain was simple. Pain had rules. This was different. This was theater. This was memory. He had been 19 the first time someone told him to kneel. Not on another world, not under alien banners, but in the smoking remains of a border town on Earth where the wrong people had been left unprotected and the right people had arrived too late. He remembered dust in his mouth then too. He remembered a medic bag that was too light and a little girl asking whether her father was still breathing. He remembered dropping to one knee beside bodies because there had been no room left to stand. And afterward, for years, every time he closed his eyes, he remembered how easy it was for power to dress itself up as order. Kneel, Vera repeated, and this time there was something stranger beneath the command. Not anger. Not cruelty exactly. Expectation. As if the universe had always worked one way, and she was merely giving him the chance to obey it. Ethan let his gaze move past her for one heartbeat, to the banners, the throne, the watching masses, the soldiers lining the edge of the stone. Then he looked back at her. Really looked. She expected fear. Or defiance. Maybe even rage. But what he saw in her, hidden so carefully it almost vanished, was certainty. The kind that had never once been challenged by mercy. Ethan shifted his weight. The restraints hummed. One of his knees dipped, just slightly, enough to send a ripple through the arena. A murmur surged through the stands. The guard behind him straightened, ready to force the moment into history. Vera's chin lifted by a fraction. And then Ethan planted his boot harder into the black stone, rose back to full height, and spat a line of blood-red dust onto the polished marble at the base of the imperial steps. The entire arena forgot how to breathe. When he finally spoke, his voice came out rough, low, and steady enough to carry farther than a shout. No, the silence after Ethan said no did not sound like silence at all. It sounded like 40,000 lungs forgetting their purpose. It sounded like heat pressing down on polished stone. It sounded like a civilization realizing, all at once, that the script it had written for this moment was no longer being followed. Commander Vera Thal did not move. Not at first. She remained exactly where she stood on the white marble steps, one gloved hand resting near the hilt at her side, her turquoise skin catching the sunlight in cold, glassy planes. But Ethan saw it anyway. The smallest fracture in her composure. Not fear. Not outrage. Confusion. It passed across her face so quickly most of the arena would have missed it. Ethan did not. He had spent too many years reading people in the half-second before they broke, before they lied, before they decided whether to pull a trigger or lower a hand. Vera was not confused because he had defied her. She was confused because he had done it without hatred. There was a difference, and she was sharp enough to feel it. The guard behind Ethan took one step forward, then another, armor humming faintly with the low electrical throb of Seraph field tech. Ethan could feel the man waiting for permission to force him down, but the order did not come. Above them, high along the circular walls of the arena, ceremonial banners cracked in the dry wind like sails under tension. The sound reminded Ethan of old aircraft canvas and hospital curtains and all the strange things the human brain decided to keep forever. "State your designation," Vera said at last. Her voice no longer carried the theatrical thunder of public ritual. It had changed. Lower now. More precise. The kind of voice used by someone who had stopped speaking to a crowd and started speaking to a problem. Ethan wiped the corner of his mouth with the back of his cuff and tasted dust again. Ethan Cole. Military rank. Former staff sergeant. A murmur passed through the tiers. The translation pylons built into the arena walls whispered his words back in layered frequencies, spilling English into the seraph tongue in 100 shimmering echoes. Former. That word mattered. He could tell by the way Vera's eyes narrowed. Former, she repeated. Meaning I do not belong to anyone now. That landed harder than he expected. Something shifted through the audience, not loud, but noticeable, like the movement of a giant animal settling in its sleep. The seraph did not think in those terms. Belonging, from what Ethan had seen in the last 72 hours, was woven into everything they built. Rank. Family line. Unit crest. Civic oath. Their entire world was architecture pretending to be morality. Even this arena had been designed to make one truth feel permanent, someone above, someone below. Vera descended one more step. Then another. She moved with the kind of control that made every gesture look deliberate enough to be law. Up close, the details of her armor became clearer. Fine silver filaments ran beneath the outer plating, pulsing faintly with bioluminescent current. Her shoulder insignia marked command authority, but there was something else there too, etched in a subtler line beneath the military crest. A dynastic seal. Ethan did not know enough about seraph nobility to name it, but he knew power when he saw it. She was not just a soldier. She was something inherited. You were recovered on the Varan Ridge perimeter, she said. 3.2 miles east of the final evacuation corridor. Human retreat had already failed. Your communications beacon was inactive. Your sidearm was empty. And yet, she paused, her gaze locking on him with clinical intensity. You were not found among your own dead. Ethan did not answer. He did not need to. The memory was already there, bright and unpleasant. Heat rolling over broken transport hulls. Sand fused into black glass. A triage marker tied around the wrist of a Seraph conscript who could not have been older than 19. A human private with a collapsed lung. A field kit that had run out of everything except gauze and stubbornness. You were found, Vera continued, inside a collapsed medical shelter. Alongside 7 wounded Seraph infantry and 2 human survivors. The arena had gone quiet again. Not the stunned quiet from before. This was a different kind. Listening. Why? She asked. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, then at the crowd beyond her, at all the elegant faces and upright posture and inherited certainty staring back from the stone. Because they were hurt. He said it the way a person might say the sky was above them or fire was hot. Simple. Annoyingly simple. The answer hit the arena like an insult. Ethan heard it in the collective shift of bodies, in the faint disbelieving hiss from the upper rows, in the tiny involuntary tightening of Vera's jaw. Not because she thought he was lying. That was the problem. She believed him. She just did not know what to do with a species that would choose compassion when strategy made more sense. For the first time since they had dragged him into the light, Ethan saw something behind her command mask that looked almost personal. Not softness. Not yet. But curiosity sharp enough to cut. And in that moment, under 40,000 watching eyes and a sky so bright it made the black stone shine like water, Commander Vera Thal made her first real mistake. She stopped seeing him as a prisoner. She started seeing him as a question. The question followed Ethan even after the arena emptied. Not out loud. The Seraph were too disciplined for that. Their curiosity moved in glances, in posture, in the subtle hush that trailed him as 2 armored guards escorted him beneath the stone tiers of the Victory Basin and into the cooler dark below. Why? Why save the enemy? Why refuse to kneel? Why stand there under a conquered sky like a man who had lost everything and still somehow kept the only thing that mattered? The corridors beneath the arena smelled different from the sunlit chamber above. Less ceremonial. More honest. Cool mineral air rolled through the passageways in faint mechanical breaths, carrying the sterile scent of recycled water, polished metal, and old stone that had not seen daylight in centuries. Blue-white strips of embedded light ran along the floor in thin lines, guiding them past sealed archways and narrow observation ports that reflected Ethan back at himself in fractured slices. He looked tired. Not dramatic movie tired. Real tired. The kind that sat in the bones and made a man feel every hour he had not slept. One sleeve of his field jacket had stiffened with dried dust and old medical gel. His knuckles were scraped. His lower lip had split just enough to sting every time he swallowed. He had seen worse. That was the problem. Memory had a way of making present pain feel organized. Familiar. Safe, even, compared to the kind that did not leave marks. They stopped at a holding chamber built into the deepest ring beneath the arena. No bars. The Seraph did not do primitive optics if they could help it. Instead, a curved field wall shimmered into visibility as the guards keyed it open, a pale translucent membrane humming faintly where air met energy. Ethan stepped inside. The room was simple enough to insult him. A steel bench fixed to one wall. A recessed water tap. A narrow slit of a viewport near the ceiling where a slice of white afternoon burned through. Just enough sky to remind him what had been taken. The field seal behind him with a soft harmonic note. One guard remained outside. The other left without a word. Ethan sat down slowly, elbows on knees, and exhaled through his nose. For the first time all day, nobody was looking at him like a symbol. That should have helped. It did not. Because the silence gave memory room to work. He had been 19 the first time someone told him to kneel and mean it. Not in a place like this. No throne. No empire. Just a roadside checkpoint in northern Syria, 7 years before first contact, where concrete barriers baked under 108-degree sun and everybody with a rifle thought fear made them taller. Ethan had been a medic then too, just younger, thinner, still stupid enough to believe every line in the field manual had been written by someone who had actually bled. Their convoy had arrived late. Civilians had already been lined against a wall by a militia that wanted cameras more than blood and obedience more than either. Ethan remembered the smell first. Burned diesel. Dust. Sweat. A child crying somewhere he could not see. He remembered one of the men in front of him dropping to his knees before anyone even shouted. Not because he was weak. Because he had a wife standing behind him and a son holding her hand, and sometimes the body made decisions morality could not reach in time. Ethan had knelt too. Not in surrender. In treatment. In the dirt beside a stranger with a chest wound he had no business surviving. He remembered pressing both hands down hard enough to save a life while boots moved around him and somebody laughed and somebody else prayed and the whole world felt arranged by men who would never have to clean up what they ordered. Later, long after the convoy cleared and the civilians were evacuated and command called it a contained incident, Ethan had realized what stayed with him was not the danger. It was the posture. The image of good people made small for someone else's theater. That was the day something in him calcified. Not rage. Not patriotism. Something quieter and harder. A private vow that if power ever asked him to decorate cruelty with obedience again, it would not get the satisfaction. A soft tone broke the memory. Ethan lifted his head. Footsteps approached outside the field wall, measured and unhurried, too deliberate to belong to a guard. Commander Vera Thal appeared beyond the shimmer a moment later, her silver-trimmed armor exchanged for a darker command mantle that fell clean and severe from her shoulders. Without the blinding arena light around her, her skin looked deeper now, less like polished glass and more like ocean water under storm clouds. She studied him for a long second through the energy field, not with the triumph of a victor, but with the alert stillness of someone standing near a door she had not expected to find. "I reviewed your capture report," she said. Ethan leaned back against the wall and looked up at her through the pale glow. "And?" Vera's violet eyes did not leave his face. "And I do not think pride is the reason you refused." Ethan said nothing. Her gaze sharpened, almost imperceptibly. "Which means," she said, "you did not stay standing for yourself." The corner of Ethan's mouth twitched once, though there was no humor in it. "No," he said quietly. "I stayed standing for the part of me that still has to live with it." For the first time since she had ordered him to kneel, Commander Vera Thal had no answer at all. Commander Vera Thal did not leave immediately. She stood on the other side of the shimmering field wall with the stillness of someone raised to believe silence could be a weapon, and for a few long seconds the holding chamber felt smaller than it was. The overhead lights cast a cool silver edge across the line of her jaw and caught faint iridescent threads woven into the dark mantle at her shoulders. Without the public weight of the arena pressing down on her, she looked less like a symbol and more like a person wearing one. Ethan had learned a long time ago that those were never the same thing. "You speak as if obedience is a stain," she said at last. Her voice was quieter down here, stripped of ceremony, and that somehow made it land harder. Ethan sat with his forearms braced against his knees, studying the pale glow of the energy field between them. "Depends on what it asks you to obey. That answer is convenient for the defeated. Maybe." He looked up at her then. "Still true." Vera held his gaze. Most people in command learn to look through others instead of at them. She did neither. She watched him the way a scientist might watch a reaction she could not explain, careful not to disturb it too soon. "Among my people," she said, "kneeling is not merely surrender. It is recognition. Order made visible. A statement that one understands where one stands in relation to power. Ethan let out a breath that was almost a laugh, though there was no amusement in it. That is one way to dress it up. Something flickered in her eyes. Not offense. Something sharper. You think us cruel. I think your empire likes architecture. That one landed. Ethan saw it in the brief narrowing of her expression, the way her chin tilted by less than an inch. Everything here is built to make hierarchy feel holy, he continued, glancing toward the curved ceiling overhead. The throne. The steps. The arena. Even this room. Somebody spent a lot of time making sure nobody ever forgets who gets to stand and who gets told where to stop. For the first time, Vera looked away from him. Just for a second. Her gaze drifted toward the corridor beyond the chamber, where the blue floor lights ran in clean uninterrupted lines toward the deeper levels of the prison ring. When she spoke again, her tone had changed. Less official. More dangerous, somehow, because it sounded closer to honest. And yet your own species built armies, she said. Borders. Courts. Flags. Uniforms. You speak as though humans arrived in the stars free of the same hunger. Ethan nodded once. We did not. The answer came so quickly it seemed to surprise her. Then why pretend otherwise? I am not pretending anything. He shifted on the bench, feeling the ache in his ribs complain at the movement. Humans built ugly systems too. Still do. We are just honest enough to know they are ugly when they are working exactly as designed. Vera turned back to him fully now. The chamber lights drew a faint silver sheen through strands of dark hair braided close behind one pointed ear, and Ethan noticed for the first time how young she actually was beneath all that discipline. Not young in years, maybe. Young in damage. The kind of person who had been shaped before she was allowed to choose what shape she wanted. You speak treason with remarkable calm, she said. You call it treason, Ethan replied. I call it being awake. That should have ended the conversation. On any other world, in any other prison, it probably would have. But Vera did not summon the guards. She did not threaten him. She only stood there with that unreadable stillness and let his words sit in the room between them like something unstable and luminous. You are not what your file suggested, she said after a moment. Ethan gave a faint shrug. Your file probably did not mention I was tired. It did not mention, Vera said slowly, that you would rather be punished than participate in your own humiliation. Ethan looked down at his hands. The restraints had left faint pressure lines around his wrists. Red, angry, temporary. There is always a price for saying no, he said. The trick is deciding which one you can still live with later. Vera was quiet for so long that Ethan almost thought she was gone still in her own head. Then she stepped closer to the field wall, close enough that the pale shimmer cast soft moving light across the turquoise planes of her face. You believe that makes you strong, she said. No, Ethan answered. I believe it keeps me from becoming something I would not respect. She stared at him then in a way that made the room feel very old. Not because she was judging him. Because some part of her, buried under years of polished command and inherited doctrine, was measuring his answer against something private and finding it difficult to dismiss. Then a chime sounded softly from the corridor behind her. A military channel. A summons. Vera's expression reset so quickly it was almost cruel. The commander returned before the woman could be fully seen. Rest while you can, Ethan Cole, she said, her voice once again sharpened into rank and ritual. Tomorrow, the Dominion will ask again. She turned and walked toward the corridor without waiting for his reply, mantle whispering over stone. Ethan watched her go until the blue floor light swallowed her silhouette and the chamber dimmed back into stillness. Only then did he lean his head against the wall and close his eyes. He had no way of knowing that above them, behind layers of white marble and imperial glass, Commander Vera Thal had just been summoned not as a soldier, but as a daughter of the bloodline that ruled the Seraph war machine. And somewhere in the Empire's highest chambers, men who had never once been forced to kneel were already deciding what to do about the human who would not. The next morning arrived without sunrise. Down in the prison ring beneath the Victory Basin, time came measured in system tones, pressure shifts, and the slow widening of the narrow viewport carved high into the chamber wall. Ethan woke to the sound of distant machinery cycling through the bones of the arena above him and the stale taste of too little sleep sitting heavy on his tongue. For a few seconds he did not move. He just listened. The Seraph built quiet differently than humans did. On Earth, silence usually meant absence. Here it meant control. Even the ventilation hummed in perfect intervals, as if the air itself had been trained not to misbehave. Ethan pushed himself upright on the steel bench, rolling stiffness out of his shoulders one joint at a time. His ribs still complained. His left wrist had gone numb sometime during the night from sleeping. Against the restraint cuff. He flexed his fingers until sensation returned in a wave of needles. Then he stood and crossed to the recessed water tap, splashing a handful of cold mineral water across his face. It smelled faintly of copper and stone. Better than blood. Better than memory. He had just finished wiping his mouth on the cleanest part of his sleeve when the corridor lights beyond his chamber flickered once. Then again. Not a power failure. A priority alert. Ethan went still. The field wall in front of his cell shimmered brighter for half a second as the prison systems rerouted current somewhere deeper in the complex. A low tone pulsed through the floor under his boots. Then came the smell. Faint at first. Warm insulation. Heated dust. The kind of smell every medic and mechanic on Earth learned to recognize before they could name it. Something electrical was going wrong. Fast. Ethan moved to the field wall and looked into the corridor. The lone guard stationed there had already turned toward the source of the alert, hand pressed to the side of his helmet as if trying to hear through the rising static on his comm line. Then, from somewhere above and to the east, a muffled boom rolled through the structure. Not an explosion in the movie sense. More like a giant metal door slamming in the wrong direction. The floor vibrated once beneath Ethan's boots. A second later, red emergency tracers flared to life along the ceiling seams, bathing the corridor in a dull crimson wash that made everything look suddenly less imperial and more breakable. The guard swore in Seraph and started moving away from the cell at a jog. He never got far. Another alarm cut across the prison ring, louder this time, followed by the sharp mechanical stutter of a failing suppression grid somewhere overhead. Then came something worse than noise. A sound Ethan recognized instantly and hated on principle. A child crying. Not close. Not in the corridor. Somewhere through the walls, carried by vents and stone and panic. High, frightened, and trying very hard not to be. Ethan turned toward the chamber door on instinct, then stopped himself because instinct was useless behind an energy field. The cry came again. Closer now. Followed by a cluster of voices barking orders in Seraph, too fast for the translation pylons to fully catch. He picked out enough. South Gallery. Structural breach. Evacuate the upper procession lane. Then the crying again. Sharp. Small. Alone. Ethan looked up toward the narrow viewport. Through the thin slice of white morning above, he could see the faintest drift of gray smoke sliding across the light. Not battlefield smoke. Indoor smoke. Vent smoke. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong air. He was already calculating distances before he could stop himself. Arena floor above. Processional corridors branching east and west. Civilian galleries likely stacked in crescent tiers. If something had ruptured near the upper ceremonial lanes, then non-combatants would be the last to receive clear instructions and the first to get trapped by design choices made by people who thought symmetry mattered more than emergency exits. Of course, Ethan muttered under his breath. You built a palace before you built a safety plan. Another impact shuddered through the walls, harder this time. Dust sifted from the ceiling seams in a soft pale rain. Somewhere outside, metal shrieked under stress. The corridor guard vanished around the bend. Then, for one suspended heartbeat, everything went still. Ethan knew that stillness too. The kind that came right before systems failed all at once. A child cried out again, this time so close he could tell it was above and to the left, maybe 30 or 40 feet away through a service shaft or collapsed utility channel. He stepped right up to the field wall, jaw tightening. "Hey," he shouted into the empty corridor. "You have civilians trapped up there." No answer. Only alarms and the rising hiss of automated containment doors trying and failing to seal. Ethan pressed both hands against the cool shimmer of the barrier and stared through it at the blood-red corridor beyond. Every instinct he had built over 15 years of triage, transport, and disaster response had just snapped awake at once. The arena above might still be an empire's monument to order. But somewhere inside it, a child was scared and alone and running out of breathable air. And for the first time since they had put him in chains, Ethan Cole stopped thinking like a prisoner and started thinking like exactly what he had always been when everything around him went wrong. The only person in the room already planning how to save somebody. By the time the third alarm hit, Ethan had already mapped the room in his head. Not because he expected to escape. Because when systems failed, people stopped noticing the things they trusted too much. Doors. Routines. Power grids. Somebody always designed them to look invincible, and somebody else always forgot smoke did not care. The field wall in front of him shimmered brighter, then dimmed by a fraction as the prison ring rerouted energy again. Ethan crouched beside the steel bench and grabbed the only loose thing in the chamber, the thin composite water tray slotted beneath the tap. Useless as a weapon. Useful as a mirror. Useful as a wedge. Useful enough. He slid it under the edge of the bench, braced one boot against the wall, and levered the metal frame just enough to expose the maintenance seam where the bench mount met the floor plate. There. A narrow strip of service conduit no wider than 2 fingers. Most people would not have noticed it. Ethan had spent too many years in damaged field hospitals not to. The crying came again, sharper now, then dissolved into a coughing fit that made something in his chest turn cold. Above him, the ventilation note changed pitch. Less airflow. More resistance. Whatever had gone wrong in the upper galleries was spreading through the ducts. "Come on," he muttered, working the tray edge into the seam until the composite bent and snapped with a dry crack. He kept the jagged shard and dropped to one knee, reaching for the small access lip built into the conduit panel. It took longer than he wanted. Everything in Seraph architecture was beautiful right up until you needed it to be practical. Finally, with a hard twist of his wrist, the panel popped free. Behind it, braided lines of pale fiber and a thin emergency bypass channel ran toward the field emitter housed in the wall. Ethan stared at it for half a second and made the same decision he had made 1,000 times in triage tents and busted transports and half-collapsed aid stations all over Earth. If the manual says do not touch it smarter than the person who wrote the manual. He used the snap tray edge to bridge the bypass contacts for less than a second. The field wall flashed white, screamed a warning tone in a language he did not need translated, and collapsed with a sharp inward pulse that smelled like ozone and scorched dust. Ethan was through the opening before the backup grid could recover. The corridor beyond was warmer than the cell, thick with red emergency light and the low mechanical groan of a building trying not to panic. He moved left, toward the crying, boots sliding once on polished stone before he caught himself. The air tasted wrong now. Dry heat and insulation smoke and the bitter edge of overheated circuitry. 20 feet ahead, one of the decorative wall panels had buckled inward, exposing a narrow service gap and a tangle of silver conduit behind it. Somewhere beyond that breach, a child was still crying in ragged bursts, trying very hard to stay brave and failing exactly the way children were supposed to fail. Ethan dropped to the floor and peered into the opening. "Hey," he called, keeping his voice low and steady. "You hear me?" The crying stopped. Then a tiny voice answered in serif, too fast for him to catch more than fear. "Good," Ethan said anyway, as if he had understood every word. "That is good. Keep talking." He wriggled one shoulder through the service gap and felt heat roll across his face from the other side. The passage beyond had once been a utility crawlspace, maybe 3 feet high, running parallel to the upper procession lane. Now part of the ceiling had slumped down at an angle, creating a wedge of trapped air and a pocket just large enough for a small body to hide inside. He saw the child then. Curled behind a fallen lattice brace, no older than 6 or 7 by human standards, skin a soft sea glass blue several shades lighter than Vera's, ceremonial white fabric darkened with soot at the hem. Not a civilian from the outer districts. Nobility, maybe. Or at least somebody raised close enough to ceremony to be dressed for it. The child stared at him with wide silver eyes and pressed both hands over their mouth to stop another cough. Ethan smiled without showing teeth, the way you did around frightened kids and wounded dogs and anyone else the world had taught to expect the worst. "Okay," he said softly. "I need you to do something really difficult." Another tremor rolled through the walls overhead, rattling the exposed conduit beside him. Somewhere deeper in the arena, a containment siren changed from warning to breach. Response. Ethan looked once at the narrowing gap, once at the child trapped behind it, and then set his shoulder against the bent support brace with a long, careful breath. He had no weapon, no leverage, no plan that deserved the name. Just smoke in the air, alarms in the walls, and a small terrified stranger looking at him like he was the only thing in the room not built to fail. Ethan did not shove the brace all at once. He leaned into it the way medics learn to move wreckage around trapped bodies, slow enough to feel what was connected to what, careful enough not to turn a survivable problem into a permanent one. The bent lattice groaned under pressure, silver struts trembling against one another as fine dust sifted down into his hair and collar. The child flinched at the sound and curled tighter into the pocket of space behind it. "Hey," Ethan said, keeping his voice level even while his shoulder started to burn. "Look at me, not the noise. You are doing great." The translation implants embedded in the corridor walls were too far away to help now, but tone crossed species better than language ever did. The child's silver eyes fixed on his face. Breathing fast. Trying not to cry again. Ethan shifted his footing, found a better angle, and pushed once more. This time the brace lifted just enough to create a gap maybe 10 inches wide. Not enough for him. Enough for small shoulders if the kid did not panic. "Can you crawl to me?" he asked, gesturing with one hand. "Slow. Hands first." The child hesitated. Ethan had seen that hesitation before too, on burned-out highways, in collapsed homes after tornadoes, in flooded basements where the dark felt alive. People did not freeze because they were weak. They froze because the body knew change was dangerous and could not tell the difference between movement and disaster. "Listen to my voice," Ethan said quietly. "That is all you have to do. Just my voice." Another cough rattled out of the child's chest. Then, trembling, they began to inch forward through the opening. One hand. Then the other. Ethan kept the brace up with his shoulder and reached into the gap with his free arm. "That is it. You are almost there." The little alien's fingers were cool and surprisingly strong when they latched onto his forearm. Ethan adjusted his stance, ignoring the sharp protest in his ribs, and guided them carefully through the space until a small soot-smudged body slid against his chest and into the corridor. He lowered the brace immediately before the rest of the crawlspace could settle. The child clung to the front of his field jacket with both hands and buried their face under his chin as another tremor rolled through the prison ring. Ethan crouched, one arm around them, the other checking quickly for obvious injuries the way muscle memory demanded. Rapid breathing. Mild smoke exposure. No visible fractures. Pulse fast but strong where he felt it flutter against the side of their neck. "Okay," he murmured. You are okay. The child said something into his jacket in broken Seraph, voice muffled and shaky. Ethan only caught one word this time. Vachel. A name, maybe. Before he could answer, a sharp command cracked down the corridor. Ethan looked up. 3 Seraph security officers rounded the far bend at a sprint, plasma batons drawn but lowered, their armor reflecting the emergency lights in jagged red flashes. They skidded to a stop the second they saw him. A human prisoner standing outside containment, covered in dust, holding a noble-born child in the middle of a structural breach was apparently not in anyone's procedural handbook. One of them barked an order and lifted a wrist unit toward Ethan. He did not move. Not because he wanted to challenge them. Because sudden movement around scared kids was stupid in every language. Easy, he said, palms visible, voice calm. The kid is alive. Smoke inhalation, maybe. Needs clean air. The officers did not lower their guard. But neither did they rush him. They were too busy trying to process what they were seeing. Then another figure appeared behind them, cutting through the corridor with the kind of speed that made rank part like water. Commander Vera Thal came into view still wearing her dark mantle, though one clasp at the shoulder had come loose and a faint line of soot marked the silver trim near her collar. Her eyes went first to the child in Ethan's arms. Then to Ethan. Then to the collapsed service breach behind him. For one heartbeat, all the discipline left her face. Lyra, she breathed. The child lifted their head at the sound of her voice and reached toward her immediately. Vera crossed the distance in 3 strides and gathered the little girl into her arms with a care so instinctive it looked nothing like command. The child buried her face against Vera's neck, still clutching one fistful of Ethan's jacket until the fabric slipped from her fingers. Ethan stood slowly, chest tight from smoke and effort and the strange weight of what he had just seen. Commander Vera Thal, heir to the military bloodline of an empire built on obedience, was holding a frightened child like the entire architecture of her world had just narrowed down to one heartbeat. When she looked back at Ethan, something in her expression had changed so completely it almost made the corridor feel colder. Not gratitude. Not yet. Something rarer. The first clean fracture in certainty. And before any of the officers around them could decide whether the escaped prisoner was now a hero or a threat, Lyra turned in Vera's arms, pointed one trembling blue hand back at Ethan Cole, and in a voice rough with smoke and wonder, called him the Seraph word for protector. No one in the corridor seemed prepared for what to do next. The alarms were still pulsing red through the walls. Smoke still threaded through the upper vents in thin gray ribbons. Somewhere above them, the arena systems groaned under the strain of rerouted power and emergency seals trying to close around a structure too ornamental to fail gracefully. And yet for one impossible moment, all of it bent around a single word spoken by a soot-streaked child in a shaking voice. Protector. Ethan stood there with dust on his shoulders and smoke in his lungs, watching the word land across the faces of armed Seraph officers who had been trained their entire lives to think of humans as unstable, dangerous, and primitive. None of them looked at him that way now. They looked at him like a contradiction. Commander Vera Thal shifted Lyra higher against her shoulder, one hand steady at the back of the child's head. The little girl had stopped crying, but she had not stopped looking at Ethan. Children had a way of deciding what a person was before adults had the chance to ruin it with politics. Vera's expression had settled back into something closer to command, but it was thinner now, held together by discipline instead of certainty. Medical station, she said sharply to the nearest officer. Immediately. The officer hesitated only a fraction before nodding and moving to guide them toward the upper triage corridor. Ethan took half a step aside to clear the path. He expected restraints. A stun order. At minimum, a guard to shove him back toward whatever version of captivity the Seraph preferred once their systems came back online. Instead, Vera stopped directly in front of him. Up close, he could see the fine soot caught along the edge of her collar and the almost invisible tension in the muscles of her jaw. She looked like someone holding two versions of reality in her hands and finding neither one stable enough to trust. "You left containment," she said. Ethan glanced once toward the collapsed breach behind him. "Your emergency design is terrible." One of the officers made a strangled noise that might have been outrage. Vera did not even blink. "You could have fled." "To where?" Ethan asked. "I am underground in an alien fortress." For the briefest second, something almost dangerous passed through her eyes. Not anger. The threat of a smile, denied before it could exist. Lyra tightened her grip on Vera's mantle and murmured something too soft for Ethan to catch. Vera listened, then looked back at him with an expression he could not read at all. "She says you told her to listen only to your voice," Vera said. Ethan shrugged once, immediately regretting it when his ribs reminded him they were still attached to him. "It usually helps." "Usually." Kids panic in every language. That did it. Not a smile. Not even close. But one corner of Vera's carefully controlled face shifted just enough to reveal she understood the shape of humor even if her world did not permit much use for it. Then she turned to one of the officers. "Clear the east access hall," she ordered. "And have the lower containment field deactivated." The officer froze. "Commander, the prisoner, is not to be touched," Vera said, and this time there was no room in her voice for uncertainty, interpretation, or appeal. The words hit the corridor like sealed doors. Ethan stared at her, not because he trusted the order, but because he understood what it cost to give it in front of subordinates. On Earth, command was often loud. Here, it was surgical. Public. Measured. A single sentence could redraw a hierarchy. Vera knew exactly what she was doing. The officer lowered his head in formal acknowledgement and stepped back. Lyra coughed once against Vera's shoulder. The sound cut through whatever else might have been said. Vera adjusted her hold immediately, all commander gone again in the presence of something more important than rank. "Bring him," she said without looking away from the child. Ethan frowned. "Bring me where?" "To medical." "I am not the one with smoke inhalation." "No," Vera said, finally meeting his eyes again. "You are the one who caused it to become survivable." For a moment Ethan just looked at her. Then at the officers. Then back at the woman who had stood in an arena less than 24 hours earlier and demanded he kneel before an empire. "You realize," he said, "this is probably not in your protocol manual." "Neither are you," Vera replied. That should not have landed as hard as it did. But something in the way she said it, without mockery, without contempt, without the usual polished edge of command, left the air between them feeling unexpectedly unarmored. Ethan fell into step a pace behind her as the corridor opened into a wider triage lane lined with glowing med panels and civilian attendants trying to restore order to a system built for spectacle instead of crisis. The red alarm still pulsed overhead, but farther apart now. More controlled. Less immediate. Around them, Seraph personnel moved quickly through the haze, and every few seconds someone looked up, noticed the human prisoner walking unshackled beside Commander Vera Thau, and forgot for one dangerous second what they had been doing. Ethan ignored them. His attention stayed on the small child in Vera's arms and the way the commander kept checking Lyra's breathing every few steps like she did not trust the universe to continue behaving while she looked away. That was when Ethan understood something important. Vera was not merely responsible for the child. She loved her. Deeply enough to break procedure. Deeply enough to reveal the person under the armor. And if that was true, then the empire above them had just made its first real mistake. It had shown him where her heart was. The Seraph medical wing was too beautiful to trust. Ethan noticed that before he noticed the blood oxygen scanners, before he noticed the polished silver arches or the translucent partitions glowing with soft blue diagnostics, before he noticed the way every medic in the room seemed to go subtly rigid the moment Commander Vera Thal stepped inside with a child in her arms and a human prisoner walking at her shoulder. Human hospitals had always smelled like antiseptic, coffee, and fatigue. This place smelled like cold stone, ionized air, and the faint floral trace of some engineered resin meant to calm people who had never been taught how. The floor beneath Ethan's boots was smooth enough to reflect the emergency lights overhead in long red ribbons. Everything about the room said order. Everything about the people in it said that order had just been interrupted by something no one had trained for. Vera did not slow until they reached a circular triage cradle in the center of the chamber. The platform rose automatically to meet Lyra's height as she laid the little girl down with both hands still hovering near her, as if letting go for even a second required conscious effort. Medical attendants moved in immediately, scanning respiratory function, pupil response, airway irritation. Lyra reached once for Vera's sleeve before one of the attendants gently redirected her hand toward a comfort filament glowing warm gold at the bedside. Vera stayed close enough for the child to see her. Ethan respected that. He had watched too many frightened patients stabilize not because the medicine worked fast, but because the right person had refused to leave. "Commander," one of the medics said after a rapid series of readings, "mild inhalation stress only. No structural injury. She will recover fully." Vera closed her eyes for one brief second. It was the smallest visible release Ethan had ever seen on another person, but it was real. When she opened them again, the commander had returned. Not completely. But enough to survive being watched. She turned toward Ethan as if only now remembering he was still there. "Sit," she said. Ethan looked around the room, then back at her. "That sounds suspiciously like an order." "It is. Then I should probably decline on principle." A couple of nearby medics froze in place, apparently uncertain whether anyone in recorded Seraph history had ever spoken to Vera Thal like that and remained conscious afterward. Vera only held his gaze for a beat longer than necessary. "You are bleeding through your sleeve," she said. Ethan glanced down. She was right. Not much. Just a fresh line of red where the rough edge of the service breach had reopened one of the cuts along his forearm. He had not even felt it. Adrenaline was rude that way. "Occupational hazard," he muttered. "Sit," Vera repeated. This time there was something else beneath the command. Not rank. Concern, reluctantly disguised. Ethan lowered himself onto the edge of an empty diagnostic bench before his ribs could vote against the idea. A young Seraph medic approached with a portable scanner and all the caution of someone handling unexploded military doctrine. Ethan lifted his arm without argument. The medic worked in silence, cleaning the scrape and sealing it with a thin line of clear biosynth gel that cooled on contact. Ethan watched the process out of habit, then watched Vera out of something less easy to explain. She had moved back to Lyra's bedside, but not all the way. Part of her remained angled toward him, attention split with the exhausted precision of someone trying to guard two fragile things at once and not yet admitting either one mattered. "She is your daughter?" Ethan asked quietly. Vera's head turned just enough to answer without fully facing him. "My brother's child," she said. Her parents were attending the council procession above the East Gallery. Ethan nodded once. That explained the ceremonial clothing. It also explained the look on Vera's face when she had first seen the child in his arms. Not command. Family. "She trusts you," he said. Vera's eyes drifted to Lyra, who had finally relaxed enough to let the med attendants continue their work without clutching at anyone. "She trusts very little," Vera said softly. "Then that means something." For a moment, the room around them blurred into background noise, soft scanner tones, murmured updates, footsteps across polished stone. Vera looked at him then, fully this time, and Ethan had the strange sensation that whatever answer she gave next would matter far beyond this room. "Among the Seraph," she said, "children are taught to fear what does not belong. It keeps them alive." Ethan leaned back against the bench, wincing only a little. "Humans tell ourselves the same thing. Usually right before we make the world smaller than it has to be." Vera absorbed that in silence. Her gaze lingered on him 1 second too long, as if trying to place the shape of a species she had been taught incorrectly. Then one of the wall displays chimed. A secure channel. Priority level black. Every medic in the chamber went still. Vera crossed to the nearest hollow panel and activated the incoming transmission with a sweep of her hand. A tall seraph male in ceremonial war regalia appeared in hard blue light, his face severe and perfectly composed in the way powerful men often mistook for wisdom. Ethan did not know his name, but he knew authority when he saw it. Vera's spine went rigid. "Commander Thal," the man said, voice clipped and resonant, "the council has convened. The human will stand formal judgment at sunset." Ethan felt the room change temperature without a single degree shifting. The holographic official continued, each word falling with polished inevitability. "By decree of the Dominion, sentence has been approved in advance. Public execution." Lyra's monitor gave a soft reassuring chime behind them. Somewhere outside the chamber, the emergency alarms had finally stopped. And in the clean, almost sacred quiet that followed, Commander Vera Thal stared at the glowing face of her empire and realized the system she had served her entire life had just scheduled the death of the man who had carried her family out of the smoke. The hologram vanished, but the sentence stayed in the room like a pressure change before a storm. No one moved for a full breath. Not the medics. Not the attendants. Not even Lyra, who had gone still on the triage cradle as if children possessed some ancient instinct for recognizing when adults had just said something irreversible. Ethan sat on the edge of the diagnostic bench with one forearm resting across his ribs and watched Commander Vera Thal stand in the fading blue afterimage of her empire's decision. She did not look shocked. That would have been easier to understand. She looked betrayed in a way too disciplined to show itself honestly. Like someone who had spent her entire life believing the machine was harsh but rational, only to discover it had begun eating its own logic while she was still inside it. "Commander," one of the medics asked carefully, as though volume itself might worsen the answer. Vera did not respond. Her gaze remained fixed on the darkened hollow panel, jaw set, shoulders straight, every inch of her trying to become command again because command was simpler than grief and much safer than doubt. Ethan had seen that posture before too. Soldiers on Earth wore it in hospital hallways after casualty reports. Police officers wore it outside schools. Fathers wore it in waiting rooms where bad news had already arrived and there was still nowhere useful to put their hands. Eventually Vera exhaled once through her nose and turned back toward the room. The commander returned in pieces. "Clear the chamber," she said. Her voice was calm. Too calm. "Maintain observation on Lyra from the adjacent station only." The medics hesitated just long enough to reveal they were not used to receiving unusual orders twice in one day. Then training one. They bowed their heads and filed out in silence, taking their soft scanner tones and clinical movement with them until only Ethan, Vera, and the child remained in the pale blue hush of the medical wing. Lyra had pushed herself upright now, wrapped in a thermal recovery blanket that made her look even smaller. Her silver eyes moved from her aunt to Ethan and back again, trying to read a room built entirely of adult things no child should have to understand. Vera crossed to her immediately and knelt beside the cradle. It was the first time Ethan had seen her lower herself for anything other than strategy or rank. "You are safe," she told the girl softly in Seraph. The words translated imperfectly through the wall unit, but tone did not need help. Lyra reached for her hand. "Is he going away?" she whispered, not quietly enough. Ethan looked down at the polished floor and let the question pass over him without trying to answer it. Vera did not look at him when she replied. "Not yet." There were 1,000 things hidden inside those 2 words. Ethan heard every one of them. A few minutes later, once Lyra had been settled into monitored rest and the chamber sealed to private mode, Vera walked to the far side of the room and keyed open a narrow service door Ethan had not noticed before. Behind it waited a small consultation alcove overlooking the city through a pane of polarized crystal. She did not invite him in so much as assume he would follow. He did. Outside, the Sereth capital stretched beneath a white afternoon sky in terraces of silver and blue stone, all elegant towers and elevated walkways and impossible geometry catching the sun like cut glass. From up here, the city looked peaceful enough to lie convincingly. Ethan stepped up beside the viewing pane and folded his arms loosely. That looked official, he said. Vera stared out at the skyline for a long moment before answering. It was. You seem surprised. I am not surprised by cruelty, she said quietly. I am surprised by inefficiency. Ethan turned to look at her. That is a very alien way to describe injustice. Her mouth shifted by half a degree. Not amusement. Recognition. Executing you now solves nothing, she said. You are a captured medic with no strategic value. The war front has already shifted beyond this system. A public execution after your refusal in the arena only creates symbolism. Ethan leaned one shoulder against the crystal wall. Maybe that is the point. Vera's eyes narrowed slightly. Explain. He looked out over the city with her. If an empire is starting to feel weak, it does not just punish enemies. It performs certainty. It finds one inconvenient person and turns them into a stage. He paused, then added more quietly, we did it on Earth too. Vera said nothing for several seconds. Below them, traffic currents moved in clean luminous streams between the towers, each one obedient to invisible rules. The council would not waste political capital on a battlefield medic, she said at last. Not unless someone wanted your death to mean more than your death. Ethan let that sit. You think somebody is using me? I think, Vera said, turning toward him fully now, that the emergency failure this morning was not random. Your sentencing was pre-approved before formal review, and my family was placed in a ceremonial gallery directly above a compromised section of structure. Ethan straightened slowly. There it was. The real fracture. Not just doubt in the system. Pattern recognition. You think this was arranged, he said. I think, Vera replied, voice low and sharpened by something colder than anger, someone inside the Dominion is building a story. Ethan studied her face, the hard turquoise planes of it now lit by late afternoon sun instead of arena fire or emergency strobes. For the first time since he had met her, Commander Vera Thal did not look like a woman protecting an empire. She looked like a woman deciding whether the empire was worth protecting at all. Then she reached into the inner fold of her mantle, withdrew a small silver access key no larger than a coin, and placed it on the console between them. At sunset, she said, they expect you to die in public. Ethan looked from the key to her eyes. And? Vera held his gaze without blinking. And I am giving you a way to disappear before they get the chance. Ethan did not touch the key right away. It sat on the console between them, catching the late sunlight in a thin silver crescent, small enough to disappear into a closed fist and important enough to redraw the rest of his life. Outside the polarized crystal, the Sereth capital gleamed with the kind of engineered beauty civilizations built when they wanted their citizens to confuse elegance with virtue. Elevated walkways arced between towers like strands of light. White transit sails drifted soundlessly across the upper air lanes. From this height, the city looked incapable of treachery. Ethan knew better. Beautiful systems broke people just as efficiently as ugly ones. Sometimes more efficiently, because they gave everyone prettier excuses. Vera stood across from him with both hands braced lightly against the console, shoulders square, expression unreadable except for the one thing she had stopped being able to hide around him. Tension. Not fear for herself. Fear for what came after choice. The key opens a maintenance corridor beneath the Western Archive wing, she said. It leads to a freight lift that services the outer transit spine. Once you reach the lower platforms, you can disappear into the civilian sectors before curfew. Ethan finally looked down at the key again. You planned this quickly. I was trained to anticipate structural failure. That is one way to describe treason. Do not flatter yourself, Vera said, though the line arrived with less edge than it wanted. I am not betraying the Dominion for you. Ethan glanced up. Then who? For a second, the answer lived in the room before she gave it. In the monitored chamber behind them. In the child asleep under a thermal blanket. In the city outside. In whatever version of her future had not included discovering that her own government could arrange danger around a little girl and call it necessity. For the people who still have to survive whatever this becomes, she said quietly. Ethan believed her. That was the problem. It would have been easier if she were sentimental. Easier if she had done this because she liked him, or admired him, or needed to prove to herself that she was not the machine she served. But this was colder and therefore more serious. Vera was not acting on impulse. She was making a military decision. And military decisions made by intelligent people tended to come with body counts later. Ethan picked up the key between thumb and forefinger, feeling its weight settle into his palm. Light. Precise. Useful. Everything a human liked to pretend choice could be. How long until sunset, he asked. 4 hours. And how long until your council realizes you are helping me? Long enough if you leave now. Ethan rolled the key once across his knuckles, then set it back down exactly where it had been. Vera stared at him. What are you doing? Declining your exit strategy. The room went very still. You cannot possibly be serious. Usually when people say that, Ethan replied, it means I am about to be inconvenient in a morally predictable way. Vera straightened fully, every line of her posture tightening. If you remain here, they will kill you in public. Probably. There is no probably. Her voice sharpened. I just watched the council authorize your death before formal judgment. This is not a debate, Ethan. No, he said evenly. It is math. She blinked once, as if the answer had arrived in the wrong language. Ethan stepped away from the crystal wall and looked through the consultation door toward the medical chamber where Lyra slept under soft blue monitors. If I vanish now, he said, who gets blamed? Vera did not answer. She did not need to. He kept going. The prisoner escapes on your watch after your family is nearly caught in a structural failure tied to a politically useful emergency. Your enemies do not need proof. They just need sequence. You lose authority, maybe custody of Lyra, definitely control of whatever comes next. And if someone inside your government is trying to build a story, a missing human helps them more than a dead one. Vera's jaw set so hard Ethan could see the muscle flex. You think I do not know that? I think you know it and handed me the key anyway. That hit where truth usually did, clean. And unwelcome. Vera looked away first, toward the skyline she no longer trusted. You owe us nothing, she said after a moment. No, Ethan agreed. But that is not the same as saying nobody here is worth staying for. Her eyes snapped back to his. For one suspended heartbeat, all the polished command and inherited restraint in the room felt one sentence away from failing. Do not do that, she said, voice low. Do not make this about morality so you can die feeling righteous. Ethan held her gaze without flinching. It is not about righteousness. He nodded toward the sleeping child in the next room. It is about pattern. Whoever is moving pieces inside your empire is not done. If I disappear, they keep control of the narrative. If I stay visible, they have to accelerate. People make mistakes when they rush. Vera stared at him like she wanted to argue and could not find a lie big enough to support it. Ethan took a slow breath, feeling the ache in his ribs and the old familiar exhaustion that came right before a bad decision you already knew you were going to make. You asked me once if refusing to kneel made me strong, he said. It does not. It just means if something ugly is coming, I would rather face it standing where it can be seen. The city beyond the glass glowed whiter as afternoon edged toward evening. Somewhere far below, the first ceremonial bells of the sunset assembly began to ring across the capital. Vera looked at the key still lying untouched on the console, then back at the human who had just refused the one mercy she knew how to offer. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded less like a commander than a woman realizing she had just met the most dangerous kind of person in the universe. The kind who could still leave and chose not to. Sunset turned the arena white. Not gold, not red, not the theatrical colors Ethan would have expected from a civilization obsessed with ceremony. Just white. Clean, blinding, almost surgical. The stone of the victory basin caught the descending light and threw it back in great pale sheets, making the entire structure look less like a stadium and more like an altar someone had carved out of a dead star. Ethan stood at the center of it. With his wrists bound in polished restraint bands that were more symbolic than necessary now. He could have fought earlier. He had not. He could have run. He had not. So the Seraph had returned to what empires always did when they needed to hide fear behind architecture. They put a single unarmed man in the middle of a beautiful place and called it justice. The crowd filling the crescent galleries was quieter than it had been the day before. Still vast. Still glittering with silver ceremonial cloth and mirrored insignia and the cool iridescent skin of 1,000 watching faces. But quieter. Word had traveled. The human prisoner who refused to kneel had also carried a child out of the smoke. Stories moved faster than governments and were much harder to arrest. Ethan could feel it in the atmosphere. Not sympathy exactly. But fracture. Doubt, once introduced into a crowd, had a temperature all its own. Above him, the council dais hovered on its elevated arc of white stone and suspended crystal, severe against the fading sky. The ruling members sat in layered formal regalia, each one framed by vertical banners that shifted faintly in the evening wind. At the center sat the same hard-faced official from the medical transmission, his posture perfect and his expression carved into something meant to resemble certainty. Commander Vera Thal stood below the dais on the military command platform, dark mantle falling in clean lines over ceremonial armor she had clearly been ordered back into for the occasion. From where Ethan stood, she looked exactly as the Empire would want her to look, composed, loyal, immovable. Only Ethan could see the lie in it now. It was in the set of her shoulders. In the way her hands rested too still at her sides. In the tiny pause before she looked at him, as if each glance had become a decision. A herald stepped forward and began reading the charges in a voice amplified by the arena's acoustic field. Refusal of submission. Disruption of ceremonial order. Escape from lawful containment. Ethan let the words wash over him. They sounded expensive. Empires love dressing panic in legal fabric. The list continued, each accusation laid out with polished precision, each one technically true in the way systems preferred truth when they were trying not to discuss context. No mention of the child. No mention of the smoke. No mention of why a captured medic had been the only person in the lower ring who knew how to think during a structural failure. That omission told Ethan everything. They were not trying to punish him. They were trying to erase the wrong version of the story before it could become contagious. The herald finally stepped back. The council official rose from his seat and looked down over the arena like a man addressing gravity itself. Ethan Cole of Earth, he declared, his voice carried in perfect resonance to every tier of the basin, you were granted the opportunity to submit to order and refused. You were offered the mercy of hierarchy and chose defiance. By decree of the Dominion, sentence shall now, no, the word did not come from Ethan. It came from below the dais, clear and sharp enough to cut through 6,000 years of ritual without needing to raise its volume. Every head in the arena turned. Vera had stepped forward from the military platform into the open center line between the council and the condemned. She did not move quickly. She did not need to. Some moments did not require force. Only refusal. The official on the dais went very still. Commander Thal, he said, each syllable carrying the polished threat of public embarrassment, resume your station. Vera did not even look at him. Her gaze remained fixed on the crowd, then shifted once toward Ethan, then back to the council with something colder than obedience settling into place behind her eyes. "The sentence is invalid," she said. A murmur moved through the arena like wind across metal. This prisoner's conduct during the Eastern Gallery breach directly resulted in the survival of a member of the ruling bloodline. The silence that followed was not empty. It was loaded. Electric. Dangerous. Ethan saw council members shift in their seats. Saw attendants whisper behind veiled sleeves. Saw uncertainty begin to leak into a ceremony designed to forbid it. The official on the dais recovered first. Men like him usually did. "Your family's private gratitude," he said, "does not supersede state judgment." Vera turned then, finally, and looked directly up at him. "This is not private gratitude." Her voice sharpened into command and carried across the basin with the terrible clarity of someone who had stopped caring whether power approved of her. This morning's breach was not random. Lower suppression systems were rerouted 43 minutes before failure. Civilian movement patterns were altered without military authorization. My niece was seated above a compromised support corridor under council security. Another murmur, louder this time. The crowd was no longer merely watching. It was thinking. Ethan felt the entire arena shift under the weight of that alone. "You arranged a death," Vera said, each word precise enough to wound without ever needing to shout. "Then attempted to use this human's execution to bury the evidence beneath spectacle." The official's face hardened. "Be careful, Commander." "No," Vera replied. "You should have been." Gasps rippled through the galleries. Not because she had spoken loudly. Because she had done something far more dangerous than rebellion. She had spoken plainly. Ethan stood in the center of the white stone and watched an empire begin to lose control of its own script. Above him, banners shifted in the cooling wind. Around him, the crowd leaned forward as one living thing. And in the space between accusation and consequence, Commander Vera Thal stepped fully between the council and the human they had planned to kill, not as a soldier obeying her station, but as a witness who had finally decided that truth was worth more than rank. For 3 full seconds, the Empire forgot how to breathe. The white basin held its silence like a wound held shut by pressure alone. Thousands of Seraph sat beneath the falling evening light, their mirrored insignia and silver ceremonial cloth no longer reflecting certainty, only confusion. On the council dais, power had finally made the mistake power always made when it stayed too long in the same room with itself. It had assumed the script was stronger than the truth. Ethan stood at the center of the arena with restraint bands still around his wrists and watched the fracture widen in real time. No one had drawn a weapon. No alarms had sounded. No dramatic collapse split the sky. It was quieter than that. More dangerous. An entire civilization had just heard one of its most decorated commanders accuse its governing class of engineering fear for political convenience, and the crowd was doing the one thing authoritarian systems could not survive for long. It was thinking. The council official rose from his seat in a slow, deliberate motion, as if dignity could still be used to control momentum. "Commander Vera Thal," he said, voice resonant and cold, "you stand on the edge of sedition." Vera did not move. The white stone beneath her boots glowed pale in the last wash of sunset, and for the first time since Ethan had met her, she did not look like someone trying to preserve the architecture around her. She looked like someone who had finally stepped outside it. "No," she said, her voice carrying clean and level through the acoustic field. "I stand at the edge of honesty. Your office simply has not seen it in some time." The crowd reacted to that one. Not loudly. A ripple. A shift. 100 tiny inhales pulled at once through thousands of lungs. Enough to tell Ethan that whatever happened next would not stay confined to this arena. The official's face hardened into the smooth expression men wore when they had already lost the room but still hoped to intimidate the furniture. "You offer allegation," he said. "Not proof." Ethan saw it then. The smallest motion at the upper eastern gallery, where the private family boxes curved along the arena wall in polished tiers of crystal and stone. A child in a pale recovery wrap had stepped into view beside two attendants before anyone could stop her. Lyra. Vera saw her too. For one instant, something raw crossed her face. Not fear for herself. Fear that innocence had just walked into politics. But Lyra did not hesitate. She moved to the edge of the gallery rail, small hands gripping the smooth white stone, silver eyes bright under the fading sky. The acoustic field caught her voice the moment she called out. "He saved me." The words were high and young and imperfectly timed, and because of that, they landed harder than any military declaration ever could. The entire basin turned toward the child. Lyra pointed down into the arena with the solemn, unwavering certainty only children and the truly honest ever possessed. "The human carried me out," she said, louder this time. "He told me to listen to his voice. He stayed." No one in the council moved. No one could. Not without revealing exactly what they were. Ethan looked up at the little girl standing above the white arena like some accidental witness the Empire had forgotten to script around, and something deep in his chest tightened in a way he had no language for. Vera's shoulders lowered by a fraction, not in relief, but in recognition. The truth had just chosen its own messenger. The official on the dais opened his mouth to recover control. He never got the chance. Movement spread through the galleries, first in pockets, then in waves. Not chaos. Something stranger. Sereth civilians, officers, attendants, nobles, one by one, row by row, began to rise from their seats. Ethan frowned, unsure what he was seeing at first. Then he understood. They were not standing for the council. They were standing for him. Not all of them. Not even most, maybe. But enough. Enough to break the geometry of obedience the arena had been built to enforce. Enough to turn a place designed for submission into something unplanned and alive. Vera turned slowly and looked out over the crowd, and Ethan watched the realization hit her with visible force. All her life she had been taught that power moved downward, from throne to soldier to citizen to captive. But here, in the cooling white light of a dying ceremony, she was watching something rise instead. Not conquest. Not fear. Recognition. The official finally spoke again, but his voice sounded smaller now, less like judgment and more like a man shouting from the wrong century. Ethan barely heard him. Because Vera was walking toward him. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Just steadily, across the center of the arena while the crowd remained standing around them like witnesses to the death of an old lie. She stopped an arm's length away. For a second neither of them said anything. Then Vera reached out, placed one hand over the polished restraint band at his wrist, and keyed it open. The metal released with a soft click so quiet Ethan almost missed it. She removed the second band the same way. No ceremony. No flourish. Just a simple act of reversal performed in front of an empire. Ethan rubbed one wrist and looked at her. Up close, her eyes were not cold anymore. They were clear. "You could still leave," she said softly, so only he could hear. Ethan glanced at the thousands of Sereth still on their feet, at the child above them clutching the gallery rail, at the city beyond the basin glowing silver under the first stars. Then he looked back at the woman who had once asked him to kneel and now stood before him having burned her entire future for the sake of what was right. "I think," he said quietly, "I might stay a little longer." It was the wrong line for a hero. Which was exactly why it belonged to a human. Vera looked at him for one suspended second, and then, against all the weight of rank and ritual and bloodline and expectation, she bowed her head. Not deeply. Not theatrically. Just enough. Not surrender. Respect. Around them, the white arena remained impossibly still. Above them, evening spread across the sky in slow blue layers, and the first cold stars appeared one by one over the Seraph capital. Ethan stood there beneath them with the last light on his face and the strange, quiet certainty that nothing in this empire would ever be arranged the same way again. He had not conquered a world. He had not defeated an army. He had not even tried to be important. He had simply done the one embarrassing